Ed Kemper did some truly disgusting things in his life. Most of us wonder what drives a person to commit such hideous deeds. Let's take a look into his past and see where this rage came from. This is the story of Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper on Now You Know. Hello and welcome. My name is Janine, and I am delighted that you're here with me today. We will start our journey in Winnett, Montana on March 17, 1921. That is the day Clarnell was born to Clarence and Nellie Stage. Clarence was a serviceman who worked for the Great Falls Gas Company, and Nellie was a stay-at-home mom caring for Clarnell and her two older siblings, Eleanor and Rex. Clarnell lived a fairly normal life. She was extremely active in school, participating in the school orchestra, sculpture club, and prom committee, as well as many others. Her favorite course was typing, and she aspired to be a secretary once she entered the workforce. In 1941, Clarnell met Edmund Kemper Jr., a dashingly handsome military man with a head on his shoulders and an extremely promising future ahead of him. Clarnell fell in love, and the couple married on November 26, 1942. As the couple settled into their new life in Los Angeles, Edmund found a career as an electrician, and the couple welcomed their firstborn on November 8, 1943, a daughter named Susan. 5 years later, Edmund Kemper III was brought into this world on December 18, 1948. And then little Olin popped in 2 years later. Edmund was still involved in the military, and he would occasionally leave for long periods of time. He was involved with the atomic bomb testing over in the Pacific. Clarnell would be left to care for the children on her own. Even when Edmund was actually home, he tended to ignore the children, with the exception of talking to young Ed about his life on the front lines in World War II. When Clarnell noticed strange behaviors in young Ed, she attempted to punish him, and Edmund would come to Ed's defense. Clarnell said Edmund favored Ed over all the other children. Of course, these disagreements would lead to many more arguments, causing the relationship to start to deteriorate. Then Edmund would be called to duty once again, leaving Clarnell with the children. It was during the time that he was gone when Clarnell became concerned for the safety of their daughters. It was reported that young Ed was cutting the heads and hands off the dolls the girls would play with, and then that led him to decapitating the family cat and then dismembering another. As Clarnell's fear of Ed grew, so did the tension between her and her husband. The arguments got worse, and Clarnell turned to alcohol as a way to cope with the stress. From Edmund's point of view, the children didn't respect him. Clarnell constantly belittled him as a provider, and now he had to deal with her excessive drinking. Enough was enough, and he packed a bag and walked away. While he was gone, things got worse between young Ed and Clarnell. He would rebel against her rules, and she would beat him with a belt in an attempt to correct his behavior, which in return, he would just rebel again, and things would escalate more and more as the cycle repeated itself over and over again. Ed had even started playing what he called death games with his little sister. That's where he would place her in a coffin that he had constructed himself out of stuff that he had laying around the house. And then there's times where he would have her tie him into a chair, and he would tell her to throw the switch, and he would pretend that he was being executed via electrocution. In 1958, Edmund decided to return to the family, but it was only briefly, as he found out Clarnell was locking Ed in the basement to keep him away from her daughters. She just didn't know what else to do with him. He was out of control, and he even admitted that he was having fantasies about death, and she feared for her life and for her daughters. When Edmund threatened to have her arrested for the abuse, she attempted to explain her reasons, but he disregarded them. He thought she was insane, abusive, and the drinking only worsened the situation. The disagreements in parenting caused a divorce between Clarnell and Edmund, and on September 28, 1961, Clarnell moved her and the children back to Montana. Young Ed was devastated over this because he felt his father was the only one who he could actually connect with, and now he was gone. Clarnell searched for a man who would be strong enough to be a father figure to her children and to get Ed back on the right path. She found these qualities in Normand Vincent Turnquist, a United States Marine veteran. They married on February 17, 1962, when Ed was about 13 years old. Normand did everything he could to help Ed overcome his dark fantasies. He even gave Ed dedicated attention where they would go on camping trips, and Normand would teach Ed how to hunt and fish. It was during one of these trips that Ed thought about killing Normand by striking him over the head with an iron bar, and then he would just take his car and then he would drive to Los Angeles to reunite with his father. But Ed actually wasn't able to bring himself to do it. A year after Clarnell and Normand married, they actually filed for divorce on June 20th, 1963. The grounds for the divorce was listed as extreme cruelty, but there are no documents explaining what exactly that entailed. So at this point, I think it's safe to speculate that Clarnell was the cruel one, as this is the second man to claim this. Edmund himself later stated that suicide missions in wartime and the later atomic bomb testing were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. Clarnell, shortly after the divorce, sent Ed to be with his father in Los Angeles. But when Ed got there, he was not happy to discover his father had remarried and was now the stepfather to a boy named David. Edmund allowed Ed to stay for a short period of time, but then found Ed was being a distraction from his new life and family, so he sent Ed back to his mother. But Clarnell did not want him back, so both parents agreed to send Ed to his paternal grandparents' home in North Fork, California in the winter of 1963. It seemed for Clarnell she would finally be able to focus her time on herself rather than having to worry about Ed. She then met her third husband, Harold Mangus Strandberg, whom she married on May 17, 1964. Now, not much is known about him other than he too was a United States Army veteran and he worked in the plumbing business. He was very similar to her two previous husbands. Young Ed had stated in an interview that he was fearful of his mother because she had the ability to manipulate a man into a raging fit of anger. She would argue until the man got to a point where he would run around the house punching walls and smashing windows, and then she would push even further until they would strike her. Following that, she would belittle them for not being able to control themselves, and then she would push them into guilt for hitting a woman. Clarnell often complained about Edmund in front of the children. She told Ed how much he reminded her of him. This caused Ed to naturally think Clarnell hated him as well. Well, there was that, and the fact that she refused to nurture the boy. She felt babying a son would turn him gay, and depriving him of love and motherly interaction would force him into becoming a strong-willed, independent man once he grew up. By the time Ed was sent to live with his grandparents, he was already having thoughts of killing Clarnell. He would daydream scenarios up, but for some reason never acted on them. The time he spent with his grandparents did not help things. His grandmother was just as overbearing and manipulative as Clarnell was. Or so Ed would say. While he lived there, he had access to rifles, where he could go out and kill birds and other wildlife. This bothered his grandmother, and she often complained that there was no reason for it other than to be destructive. Now I'm going to step aside here for just a moment as I want to interject my own thoughts on something. I want to know why, when a family member knows there is an issue with a child, why do they permit them to have access to firearms? The Highland Park parade shooter Robert Crimo is one example. The father of that monster helped him to get his gun permit despite the fact that there were previous incidences where Robert threatened to kill him and his own family. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. While you're doing that, you might as well hit the subscribe button. I would very much appreciate it. Now let's get back to Ed. As I said before, he had access with his guns while living with his grandparents, Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr. On August 27, 1964, Ed grabbed his .22 rifle and started to head out the door when his grandmother warned him again, "Do not shoot the birds." This annoyed Ed, to the point where he was not able to control himself. As she turned her back on him, Ed raised the gun and shot her in the back of the head and then twice into her back. Moments later, he did the same to his grandfather. Now, after everything was done, Ed could have ran off. He could have buried the bodies and even lived there alone for a while, at least until someone found out what happened. But he didn't do either of those things. He actually just called Clarnell and asked her what he should do. She instructed him to call the cops and to wait for them, and he did exactly as she instructed. The authorities came and picked him up and took him to Atascadero State Hospital for the next 5 years. Clarnell was interviewed about the killings. She was quoted to say, "Pressure must have been building. Maud wrote about how happy he was with his gun and dog and great authors in school. It wasn't until the tragedy that I was told by his father that he was beginning to worry and frighten them with his moods. I wish I had known." But really, she did know all along. She even, in a drunken stupor one night, called Edmund to warn him about how bad Ed was and to not be surprised if he ended up killing them one day. But she still, despite the fears that she had, never sought professional help for Ed and continued to allow him free range with weapons at his disposal. Now, it's kind of hard to track down Clarnell's activities during the time Ed was in the mental hospital, other than the fact that she and Harold divorced and then she moved to Santa Cruz, taking a job at the University of California. On December 18, 1969, Ed had turned 21 years old and had been able to convince his caretakers that he was reformed and would no longer be a threat to society. His record was wiped clean, as if he never killed his grandparents, and he was released. The hospital staff warned Ed not to be in contact with his mother, as they agreed that she was the source of his anger and frustrations. But unfortunately, Ed had nowhere else to go. It didn't take long for Ed to find employment working for the Highway Department of Transportation, and he was able to make enough money to move out from underneath Clarnell's grip. But Clarnell made sure to call constantly and to also stop in unannounced. This, of course, annoyed Ed, which I believe was her entire reason for doing so. Ed started to have trouble keeping his bills paid. His rent fell behind, and he was evicted and once again forced to move back in with his mother. Ed claimed that during the time that he lived with her, she would belittle him more than when he was a child. Now he was a grown man, and she would throw horrible comments into his face. She would talk about all the beautiful students she would see at work and how Ed would never be able to get a woman like them. Why? Because he was so much like his own father. He would never be good enough to be able to be in a relationship with any respectful woman. Ed attempted to get her to stop. He argued back. He stood up for himself. He told her she was pushing him over the edge. She didn't listen. She continued to escalate it. Ed even got physical, pushing her and hitting her. He would scream at her, threaten to kill her even. The neighbors heard the arguments many times, but she still continued to harass, belittle, and degrade him. Ed needed to find a way to release his anger. That is when he started to hunt women. Whenever he and Clarnell would get into a bad argument, Ed would go hunting for relief. He would murder a young co-ed, and then he would feel better, and the cycle would repeat over and over again, until Ed realized the connection himself. He hated his mom, but he wanted to love her. He wanted to kill her, but he didn't want to lose his only mother. He knew he needed to stop the madness, and there was only one way to do it. On April 19, 1973, Clarnell went out for a good time and came home intoxicated. Ed walked into her room to talk with her, and she disregarded him, saying she was just not in the mood. A few hours later, when he knew that she was sound asleep, he snuck back in. This time, he had a hammer and a penknife with him. He bludgeoned her to death with the hammer before decapitating her corpse and disposing her into the closet. The very next morning, he called her best friend Sally to come over for lunch, and when she arrived, he strangled her to death before decapitating her as well. Now, this was a very traumatic ending for Clarnell, and nobody deserves to die the way she did. But let's think about things for a moment. There were many times during this story where she could have stepped up to prevent maybe not all, but at least some of Ed's actions. And if you listen to Ed, and most of this information comes from his interviews, it seems like she kind of pushed him into it. With that being said, Clarnell did not have a chance to stand up for herself against these allegations. So now I'm going to introduce you to my Mothers of Murder's Best Mom Scale, which is totally scientific, by the way. It is in my personal opinion that Clarnell was a better mom than Augusta Gein, but she doesn't hold a candle to Louise Bundy. If you're interested in hearing their life stories, they're available right here. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, take care, stay safe, and thanks for listening.